Imagine you are handed a candle, a box of thumbtacks, and a book of matches, and you are asked to attach the candle to the wall so that the wax does not drip on the table below. Now imagine two versions of you attempt this. One version is told simply to solve it. The other version is told that if you solve it quickly, you will be paid handsomely. Common sense says the paid version wins. Common sense is wrong. In the experiment that made this puzzle famous in motivation research, the people offered money took longer, on average, than the people offered nothing at all. Roughly 3.5 minutes longer. The reward, which was supposed to sharpen focus, narrowed it instead, and narrowing was exactly the wrong move for a problem that required seeing the tack box not as a container, but as a shelf. That single result is the crack in the wall that Daniel Pink widens into a doorway in his book Drive, the surprising truth about what motivates us. His claim is not that money does not matter. His claim is more unsettling than that. It is that we have built our schools, our offices, our compensation plans, and a good part of our parenting around a theory of human motivation that the science stopped supporting roughly half a century ago, and that we keep using it anyway because it feels obvious, because it is easy to administer, and because the alternative asks more of us. Drive is an argument that the gap between what science knows and what business does has become one of the most expensive gaps in modern life. And Pink's proposal for closing it is not a slogan about passion. It is a specific architecture with 3 load-bearing walls: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Daniel H. Pink is not a research psychologist, and he does not pretend to be. He is a synthesizer, a translator, a man who reads the journals so you do not have to and then tells you what the findings mean for the way you actually live. He earned his undergraduate degree at Northwestern University, where he was a Truman Scholar and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and then took a law degree at Yale. He has said, more or less cheerfully, that he never practiced law, which is a fact he seems to regard as a public service. Before he became an author, he worked in politics and government, and from 1995 to 1997, he served as chief speechwriter to Vice President Al Gore. Speechwriting is a useful apprenticeship for what he does now. A speechwriter's job is to take something complicated and true and make it land in the ear of a listener who is only half paying attention. Pink has written 5 New York Times bestsellers: A Whole New Mind, Drive, To Sell as Human, When, and The Power of Regret. He has also hosted and co-executive produced a National Geographic Channel series about human behavior called Crowd Control, which aired in more than 100 countries. And in 2009, the same year Drive was published, he gave a TED Talk called The Puzzle of Motivation, which laid out the book's core argument to an audience that then carried it into a great many conference rooms. For a large number of managers, that talk was the first time anyone had told them that their incentive plan might be actively making things worse. Drive was published by Riverhead Books at the very end of 2009, on the 29th of December, in a hardcover of about 256 pages. A paperback followed on the 5th of April, 2011, running longer at roughly 288 pages, and the publisher noted that this edition added newer studies, fresh examples, and additional tools and exercises. The timing matters. The book arrived in the wreckage of the 2008 financial crisis, at a moment when the public had just watched enormous bonus structures produce enormous catastrophe. Pink was not writing about that crisis directly, but he was writing into a mood. People were ready to hear that the incentive was not a neutral instrument, that you could rig a reward system so cleverly that it destroyed the thing it was meant to encourage. The book draws on roughly 4 decades of research on human motivation, most centrally the body of work known as self-determination theory, developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester. Pink's contribution is not the discovery. It is the insistence that the discovery has practical consequences and the patience to spell out what they are. Pink's organizing metaphor is software. A society, he argues, runs on a motivational operating system, a set of assumptions about what makes people do things, and that operating system has been upgraded twice. Motivation 1.0 was biological survival. We ate because we were hungry, we ran because something was chasing us, and the system worked well enough for a very long time. But as human beings began cooperating in larger groups, Biology alone could not coordinate the necessary behavior, so we installed Motivation 2.0. This is the operating system of reward and punishment, of the carrot and the stick, of the assumption that people are fundamentally a bit lazy and will only work if you dangle something in front of them or hold something over them. In the language of the management theorist Douglas McGregor, this is Theory X thinking, the belief that workers avoid effort by default and must be driven. And here is the crucial point that Pink insists we not lose in our enthusiasm for debunking. Motivation 2.0 worked. It worked magnificently. It was the right operating system for the 20th century because the 20th century ran on routine work. If the job is putting the same bolt in the same hole 800 times a shift, then a bonus for the 850th bolt is a perfectly sensible piece of engineering. Algorithmic work with a known path from problem to solution, responds well to external incentives. There is nothing mystical about it. The problem is that the composition of work changed and the operating system did not. Routine work has been steadily automated or outsourced. What remains and what is growing is non-routine work that requires judgment, synthesis, creative problem-solving, work where nobody can hand you the algorithm because the whole point of your job is to invent one. Pink notes that we tried to patch the old system, calling the patch 2.1, adding casual Fridays and stock options and Employee of the Month plaques on top of the same basic assumptions. The patches did not take because the underlying architecture was mismatched to the work. That mismatch is where the science becomes uncomfortable. And the science, Pink shows, has been sitting there in plain sight, ignored, since the middle of the last century. Drive opens with 2 puzzles, and the elegant thing about the opening is that both are literally puzzles. In 1949, the psychologist Harry Harlow, working with 2 colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, set up a 2-week learning experiment with 8 rhesus monkeys. He placed mechanical puzzles in their cages, the kind that require you to pull a pin, lift a hook, and open a lid in the correct sequence. The monkeys were not taught how to solve them. They were not fed for solving them. They were given no reward whatsoever. And they solved them anyway, repeatedly, with apparent enjoyment, and they got better at it over the 2 weeks. This was not supposed to happen. According to the 2 prevailing theories of the day, behavior was driven either by biological drives or by external rewards and punishments, and here were 8 monkeys doing a difficult thing for neither reason. Harlow proposed a third drive, an intrinsic one, the performance of the task providing its own reward. Then, to test it, the researchers introduced raisins as a payoff. The monkeys got worse. They made more errors and solved the puzzles less often. Harlow's finding was strange enough that the field largely set it aside, and Harlow himself moved on to other work. 2 decades later, a graduate student named Edward Deci picked the thread back up. At Carnegie Mellon University around 1969, Deci ran a study using the Soma cube, a puzzle of 7 plastic pieces that can be assembled into a very large number of shapes. He brought participants in over 3 sessions and asked them to reproduce various configurations. On the second day, he paid one group $1 for each configuration they successfully built and paid the other group nothing. Then, in each session, he engineered an interval where he told the participants he had to leave the room for a few minutes and they could do whatever they liked. There were magazines on the table. There was also the puzzle. The unpaid group kept playing with the puzzle during the free time, and by the 3rd session they were playing with it slightly more than before. The paid group played with it more during the session they were paid for, and then, on the 3rd day, when the money went away, they played with it noticeably less than they had at the very beginning. The reward had not simply failed to add motivation. It appeared to have subtracted some of the motivation that was already there. Deci wrote that money may work as an extrinsic reward in the short run, but that it can reduce a person's intrinsic interest in the activity itself. This work grew into self-determination theory, developed with Richard Ryan, which holds that human beings have innate psychological needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness, and that when those needs are met, people are more motivated, more productive, and happier. Pink's rhetorical move is to place these 2 experiments at the front of the book and then ask the obvious question. If we have known this since 1949 and known it with increasing precision since 1969, why does nearly every organization on the planet still run on if-then rewards? Pink's answer to when rewards fail is not that they always fail. He is careful about this, and the care is what makes the book credible rather than merely provocative. The distinction he draws is between if-then rewards, which are announced in advance and made contingent on performance, and now-that rewards, which arrive unexpectedly after the work is done. If-then rewards are the dangerous ones, because they are the ones that convert an activity into a transaction. He catalogs 7 ways they misfire, which he frames as 7 deadly flaws. They can extinguish intrinsic motivation. This is the Deci effect. Pay someone for something they were doing for love, and you may find you have bought the behavior rather than encouraged it, and that when you stop paying, the behavior stops too. Pink calls this the Sawyer effect, borrowing from Mark Twain's observation that work is what a body is obliged to do and play is what a body is not obliged to do. Tom Sawyer turns whitewashing into play by making it scarce. Bad management does the reverse, turning play into work. They can diminish performance. This is the candle problem finding from Carl Dunker's classic puzzle as tested with incentives by the psychologist Sam Glucksberg. Rewards focus attention, and focus helps enormously when the solution lies straight ahead. When the solution requires peripheral vision, the same narrowing hurts. Pink also points to work associated with Dan Ariely and colleagues, including experiments run in rural India with support from researchers at the London School of Economics, in which unusually large financial incentives were associated with worse performance on tasks requiring even rudimentary cognitive skill. He notes as well a review by economists at the London School of Economics examining dozens of studies of corporate pay-for-performance schemes, which found that financial incentives can have a negative impact on overall performance. They can crush creativity. If the reward is attached to a specific defined output, the safest path to it is the conventional path, and the conventional path is by definition not the creative one. They can crowd out good behavior. Pink cites the well-known case of blood donation and of daycare centers that introduced fines for late pickup. Attaching a price to a moral act can transform it into a market transaction, and once it is a transaction, people feel entitled to buy their way out of the obligation. They can encourage cheating, shortcuts, and unethical behavior. Any goal specific enough to be rewarded is specific enough to be gamed. When the metric becomes the target, people optimize the metric, not the underlying good you actually wanted. They can become addictive. If-then rewards require escalation. The bonus that thrilled last year is the baseline this year. Pink notes the parallel to other addictive stimuli, where the same dose produces a diminishing response. And they can foster short-term thinking. Quarterly targets produce quarterly behavior. If you pay for this quarter's number, you will get this quarter's number, sometimes at the cost of everything that would have made the next 5 years work. Read together, these 7 flaws describe a mechanism, not a list of accidents. Extrinsic rewards convert an open-ended, self-directed activity into a closed, other-directed one, and open-endedness is precisely the quality that non-routine work depends on. Out of this analysis, Pink builds his central character distinction. He describes 2 patterns of behavior, which he labels Type X and Type 1. Type X behavior is fueled primarily by external rewards, and the activity is chiefly a vehicle for reaching them. Type 1 behavior, by his description, is fueled more by intrinsic desires than extrinsic ones, concerning itself less with the external rewards to which an activity leads and more with the inherent satisfaction of the activity itself. Pink makes 4 claims about Type 1 behavior that are worth holding on to. First, it is made, not born. This is not a personality type you are stuck with. Conditions produce it, and conditions can be changed. Second, in the long run it almost always outperforms Type X, even by Type X's own scorecard. Type 1 people, over time, tend to achieve more, not less, than people who are chasing the reward directly. Third, Type 1 behavior does not disdain money or recognition. It simply requires that compensation be handled well enough that it stops being the topic. And fourth, Type 1 behavior is a renewable resource. Extrinsic motivation depends on a supply of carrots that must constantly be replenished and escalated. Intrinsic motivation, like sunlight, keeps arriving. That last point is the quiet economic argument at the heart of the book. Motivation 3.0 is not just kinder. It is cheaper to sustain. The first of the three elements is autonomy, and Pink is precise about what he means. Autonomy is not independence, and it is not a rejection of accountability or teamwork. It is acting with choice. You can be autonomous and interdependent at the same time. What autonomy opposes is not connection but control. He breaks autonomy into 4 dimensions, which he calls the 4 T's. Autonomy over task is control over what you work on. Autonomy over time is control over when you work. Autonomy over technique is control over how you do the work. And autonomy over team is control over whom you do it with. Most organizations grant a little of one of these and none of the others, and then wonder why engagement surveys come back grim. The examples he assembles are the most concrete part of the book. There is Google's celebrated 20% time, the practice of letting engineers spend a portion of their week on projects of their own choosing, which produce Gmail and Google News among other things. There is the Australian software company Atlassian and its FedEx Days, so named because participants have 24 hours to work on anything they like as long as they deliver something overnight. A burst of pure task and technique autonomy that reliably produced fixes and features nobody had thought to assign. There is the results-only work environment, developed by Callie Ressler and Jody Thompson and first implemented at Best Buy, in which schedules essentially disappear. People are not required to be anywhere at any particular time. Meetings are optional. What is required is that the work gets done. Pink reports that under such arrangements, productivity tended to rise and turnover tended to fall, which is exactly what you would predict if the schedule was never the thing producing the work in the first place. And there is the argument from open source, which Pink treats as the strongest available natural experiment. Linux, Apache, Firefox, and Wikipedia were all built by people who were not paid to build them, competing successfully against products built by people who were. Wikipedia against Microsoft's Encarta is the case he lingers on. Encarta had professional writers, professional editors, a budget, and a distribution channel. Wikipedia had volunteers and a set of rules. Encarta is gone. If Motivation 2.0 were the complete theory of human effort, this outcome would be impossible. Pink's conclusion is that the default management assumption is backwards. We do not need to be prodded into activity. Our default state is curious and self-directed, and the reason so many workplaces look otherwise is that they have carefully arranged the conditions to make it so. The second element is mastery, which Pink defines as the desire to get better and better at something that matters. Where autonomy is about the conditions of work, mastery is about the trajectory of a person through it. He begins with flow, the state described by the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, in which a person becomes so absorbed in an activity that self-consciousness and time awareness fall away. Flow arrives when the challenge of the task is exquisitely matched to the capability of the person. Too easy and you are bored. Too hard and you are anxious. Pink calls the well-matched middle a Goldilocks task, and he argues that one of the most underappreciated jobs of a manager is simply the calibration of difficulty, making sure every person has work that stretches them by about the right amount. Then he offers 3 laws of mastery, and they are, I think, the most personally useful pages in the book. Mastery is a mindset. Here he draws on Carol Dweck's research on implicit theories of intelligence. People who hold an entity theory believe intelligence is a fixed quantity you either have or lack. People who hold an incremental theory believe it is something you grow through effort. The difference in belief produces an enormous difference in behavior, because if ability is fixed, then every difficulty is evidence about your ceiling and is therefore threatening, while if ability is grown, difficulty is simply the mechanism of growth. Goals become performance goals for the first group, proving what you can do, and learning goals for the second, becoming able to do more. Mastery is only available to people who believe it exists. Mastery is a pain. This is the corrective to every comfortable story about following your bliss. Drawing on Anders Ericsson's research into deliberate practice and on Angela Duckworth's work on grit, Pink emphasizes that getting good at anything difficult requires years of effortful, often tedious, deliberately uncomfortable repetition. aimed specifically at what you cannot yet do. Flow is the experience of a well-matched moment. Mastery is the accumulation of thousands of them, plus a great many badly matched ones you pushed through anyway. He quotes the sentiment, attributed to a swimming coach in his account, that the pursuit is not fun in the ordinary sense, and that satisfaction comes from doing what others are unwilling to do. And mastery is an asymptote. This is the most bittersweet of the three. An asymptote is a line a curve approaches forever and never touches. You can get closer to mastery indefinitely and never arrive. Pink's point is that this is simultaneously the source of the frustration and the source of the appeal. A goal you can finish stops motivating you the moment you finish it. A pursuit that never ends never stops giving you a reason to return tomorrow. The third element is purpose, the yearning to do what we do in the service of something larger than ourselves. Pink argues that purpose has always been present in human motivation, but has often been treated as ornamental, a nice thing companies put on the wall rather than an operating principle. He makes an interesting demographic observation. The baby boom generation, enormous in number and now moving through the later parts of their careers, has begun confronting mortality in a way that reframes the question of what work is for. That, combined with a rising generation that expects meaning as a condition of employment rather than a perk, has pushed purpose from the periphery toward the center. The argument's evidential core is a study by Deci and Ryan and colleagues tracking university graduates and their goals. Some graduates held predominantly extrinsic goals, oriented toward wealth and status. Others held predominantly intrinsic goals, oriented toward helping others, growing, and contributing. The intrinsically oriented group reported higher satisfaction and well-being and lower anxiety after leaving school. The extrinsically oriented group, even when they attained their goals, did not show the expected gains and in some respects reported more anxiety and worse well-being than they had as students. Achieving a profit goal, it turns out, does not reliably deliver the feeling that was supposed to come with it. Pink's phrase for this is that these are not goals that nourish. At the organizational level, he proposes that purpose maximization should sit alongside profit maximization rather than beneath it, and he identifies 3 places where it shows up or fails to. Goals, meaning whether the organization defines success in terms that include something beyond the number. Words, meaning the vocabulary leaders actually use. He invokes Robert Reich's pronoun test, the practice of asking employees about their company and listening for whether they say we or they. Organizations where people say they have a problem no amount of mission statement can fix. And policies, meaning whether people are actually given room to act on purpose rather than merely to feel it. He points to the rise of enterprises structured to pursue social ends alongside financial ones, and to companies like Tom's Shoes that built the purpose into the transaction rather than bolting it on afterward. The 3 elements are not a menu. They interlock. Autonomy without mastery produces aimless freedom. Mastery without purpose produces excellent work in service of nothing. Purpose without autonomy produces a person who believes in the mission and is not trusted to advance it, which may be the most demoralizing combination of all. The last third of the book is deliberately practical, and its structure tells you something about Pink's intent. He includes 9 strategies for individuals, 9 ways to reshape organizations, 9 ideas for parents and educators, a reading list of 15 books, summaries of 6 business thinkers, a 4-part fitness plan, a recap of the argument, a glossary of terms, and a discussion guide with 20 conversation starters. This is not a book that wants to be admired. It wants to be used, argued over in a book club, and applied on a Monday. The section that most often gets misread is the one on money, so it deserves emphasis. Pink is not saying pay does not matter. He is saying that pay must be handled correctly precisely so that it can recede from view. He calls this the Zen of compensation, and it rests on a few principles. Baseline rewards must be adequate, meaning salary, benefits, and conditions sufficient for a decent life. Compensation should be internally fair so that people doing comparable work are not left resentful, and externally fair so that people are not underpaid relative to the market. And he suggests paying somewhat more than average, which buys not only talent, but the removal of the subject from daily consideration. The underlying idea is that money is a hygiene factor with a threshold. Get it wrong and nothing else you do about motivation will matter because the person is preoccupied and insulted. Get it right and the question goes quiet and the intrinsic drivers get the room they need. Pink also recommends that if you must reward, prefer unexpected now that rewards over announced if then ones, prefer praise and useful feedback to cash bonuses, and prefer rewarding whole categories of contribution over narrow metrics that invite gaming. For individuals, the toolkit includes practices like giving yourself a performance review by setting your own goals and grading yourself against them monthly, asking at the end of each day whether you were a little better than yesterday, and identifying your single sentence, the one line that would summarize what your life was about. For organizations, he suggests experiments in scheduled autonomy, banning non-essential status distinctions, and involving people in setting their own targets. For parents and educators, he presses toward homework that passes an autonomy test, allowances decoupled from chores so that neither is corrupted, and praise directed at effort and strategy rather than at innate ability. It should be said, in fairness, that drive has its critics. Some researchers have argued that Pink states the case against extrinsic rewards more strongly than the underlying literature supports, pointing to meta-analyses that find the undermining effect is real but narrower in scope than a general reader might infer, and noting that the effect is clearest for tasks people already found interesting. Others have observed that the corporate examples in books of this genre have a habit of aging badly, and indeed some of Pink's showcase practices were later scaled back at the companies that pioneered them. These are worth knowing, but they qualify the argument rather than dissolve it. Even the most conservative reading of the evidence supports the practical claim that if-then rewards are a blunt tool applied far beyond the domain where they work well, and that autonomy, mastery, and purpose are cheap, powerful, and chronically underused. The first takeaway is diagnostic. Before you choose a motivational strategy, classify the work. If the task is routine, with a clear path from start to finish, extrinsic incentives will probably help, and you should use them without guilt. If the task is non-routine, requiring creativity, judgment, or synthesis, then if-then rewards are likely to narrow attention exactly where breadth is needed, and the more you escalate them, the worse the effect may be. Most of the motivational damage in modern organizations comes from applying the right tool to the wrong category of work. The second is that the shape of the reward matters as much as the size. Announced, contingent, if-then rewards turn activities into transactions. Unexpected, after the fact, now that rewards tend not to, because there was nothing to bargain against while the work was being done. If you want to recognize someone, surprise them. The third is that pay is a threshold, not a lever. Pay people enough, pay them fairly relative to their colleagues and to the market, and then get money off the table so the real motivators have oxygen. Trying to buy engagement with bonuses while underpaying base salary is the worst of both worlds. The fourth is that autonomy has 4 dimensions and you almost certainly control at least one of them for someone. Task, time, technique, team. You may not be able to reinvent your organization's schedule, but you can often let a person choose how they solve a problem or whom they solve it with. Small grants of genuine autonomy compound. The fifth is that mastery begins as a belief. If you or the people you lead hold a fixed view of ability, no amount of practice architecture will help, because difficulty will keep registering as a verdict rather than as a workout. Change the belief first, then build the deliberate practice, then accept that the destination recedes forever, and that this is a feature. The sixth is that purpose is tested by policy, not by proclamation. Anyone can write a mission statement. The question is whether people are permitted to act on it when doing so costs something, and whether they say we or they when they describe the place they work. And the seventh is the one Pink returns to most often. Type 1 behavior is made, not born. This means the person who seems unmotivated is very often a person whose conditions are wrong, and it means the fix is available. That is a demanding conclusion, because it removes the excuse. It is also a hopeful one for exactly the same reason. There is a particular kind of book that succeeds by telling you something you already suspected but could not defend. Drive is that book for anyone who has ever sat in a meeting where a new incentive plan was unveiled and felt a small private conviction that it would not work without being able to say why. Pink hands you the why, along with the studies, the vocabulary, and the arguments. What stays with me is not the corporate case studies, which are the most perishable part of any business book, and some of which have already been quietly revised by history. What stays is the image of Harlow's monkeys in 1949, solving puzzles nobody paid them to solve, and then solving them worse once the raisins appeared. Something in that finding is very hard to unsee. It suggests that the drive to figure things out, to get better, to be absorbed in something difficult, is not a luxury we permit ourselves once the real motivators are satisfied. It is closer to a baseline condition of being a curious animal, and most of what we call motivating people is actually the labor of undoing the damage we have done to it. Pink's argument, stripped to its frame, is that we spent a century getting extremely good at managing routine work and then kept using those methods on work that is not routine, and that the cost of this mismatch is measured in mediocre products. Disengaged employees, bored students, and a great many capable people who suspect their best years of curiosity are behind them. The alternative he proposes is not soft. Autonomy requires trust that is uncomfortable to extend. Mastery requires pain that is genuinely painful. Purpose requires giving up the simplicity of a single number. Motivation 3.0 is more demanding than the carrot and the stick, not less. But the promise underneath it is worth the demand. It is that the deepest motivation is not something you have to install in people. It is something you have to stop interfering with. And the practical work, whether you are running a company or a classroom or just your own week, is mostly the work of clearing space, enough autonomy that the choice is real, enough challenge that the difficulty fits, and enough meaning that the effort points somewhere beyond yourself. Do that, and the drive shows up on its own. It was always there. It was waiting for the raisins to be taken away.